We're looking here at a little blue heron sitting in a tree, which is something that herons do when they're resting sometimes, or they'll also often build their nests in trees. Although actually most of their day is not spent in trees. They spend most of their day associated with marshes and marsh creeks and that sort of place where they catch, well, in the case of this species at least, they catch fish. Now, this species I have here because it relates to the last two species that we were looking at in our last program, the marsh wren and the Virginia rail, both smaller birds than this one. And if you recall, I said that those birds could live in relatively little marshes as well as big marshes. Now, a bird like a heron tends to be much more associated with larger sites, and when you get to small sites, they're pretty much always absent. And this brings us back to our discussion of the species area effect. We can define the species area effect like this. It's a positive relationship that exists between the number of species found and the size of a habitat. So as the habitat grows, the number of species also tends to grow. It's about as close as you can come to a law in the field of ecology. It's something that seems to pretty much always be true. Now, I've been hinting by looking at several different species that live in marshes, hinting at what underlies this relationship. It's something that's been of interest to ecologists for a long time. Better part of 100 years at least, people have been exploring this idea. Well, much of the answer to that question in many situations has to do with the number of microhabitats or habitat types that you find within an area. So let's take a look at an image that gives us some indication of that. We're looking here at a satellite infrared image over which vegetation types have been plotted. So those green areas are one kind of plant community, and the blue areas are another, and the purple areas and the pink areas, and so we're all different plant associations found within this wetland complex. And so the thinking is that as a habitat area, like a marsh or most any kind of habitat you can mention, as those things get bigger, you're going to find more diversity within them. And then you're going to find species that specialize in all those microhabitats or subhabitats or whatever else you care to call them. So in the case of marshes and our little blue heron, for example, the herons don't really care too much about the plant life, but they do care very much about the occurrence of creeks and pools within the marsh. And so if those are absent, the herons tend to be absent because there's no place for them to hunt for fish. They also often are associated with tidal flats in wetlands that have tidal influence. So they can walk along the mud at low tide and hunt in the pools that are left on the surface of the mud flat, in addition to the creeks. So when we add those habitats, we can add species like the little blue heron. Now, of course, nothing is ever quite that simple in the field of ecology. The harder we look at things, the more complex these relationships become. So even if we hold habitat constant and take a look at areas of different size, we still see this species area effect. And that relates to these graphs that you're looking at on the right-hand side of the image here. If we graph species versus area, we still see that relationship. Notice it's kind of a curvilinear relationship. And often what we see when we plot data like this is that it turns out to be a power function, an equation of the form y equals ax to the n, something like that. So what we often do to simplify things is to plot the data with logs. And so if you plot a log-log graph, we get a nice straight line, which is very easy to deal with. Not that curvilinear graphs are all that terribly difficult to deal with mathematically either, but straight line is a simplifying kind of a technique for us to examine data. Now the data you're looking at are real data from these very marshes that I've been showing you photographs of. And so this is a study that I was involved in for a long time. It takes a lot of years to really unravel some of these kinds of things. Despite the fact that people have been studying species versus area for a very long time, there still have been some very big pieces of the puzzle missing. And so that's what I was after trying to find with some of those pieces. And so what I discovered was that when you do hold habitat constant, when you can factor that out as a interfering kind of a variable, and we just look at the effect of size on communities, what we discover is that a number of common sense kinds of things happen. When areas get bigger, species that have larger area requirements, larger home ranges or larger territories, those things show up. We also discover that less common species tend to drop out in the smallest areas of habitat, and that we can relate to just simply random effects. We can start discussing the probability of a single pair of some species colonizing a tiny area. And what we tend to see happen is that as areas get very small, the probability of their colonizing simply goes down. When an area is larger, the probability of that species colonizing goes up. And there's also another phenomenon to consider. If we go back to our last program and our discussion of the Virginia rail and the marsh wren, certain species seem to have some innate sense of what a habitat should look like in terms of how big it is before they recognize it as being a suitable habitat. And so you run into that kind of a phenomenon where species will simply no longer recognize an area as being suitable if it's too small, so it becomes a behavioral issue. So a whole variety of effects like that are involved in giving rise to this species area effect. Now this species area phenomenon also has rather significant conservation implications. If, for example, we have a large block of habitat occupied by a number of species, if we then break up that habitat, if we have a woodland, for example, and we log off parts of it, or a marsh and we fill in parts of it, then what's left is likely to not support so many species anymore. If we just have fragments of that original habitat, the fragments are not going to support the number of individuals that we found in the former larger block of habitat. Now let's extend this species area idea to oceanic islands. We're looking here at the Palau Islands of the Western Tropical Pacific, which is a collection of a large number of islands. The largest one is the island of Babeldop, which is what's in the foreground. And as we look toward the background, we are seeing a whole series of islands going from fairly good size. The one in the background here is the island of Nerak Tabel. But then there are these tiny little islands in midground. And so we have islands in the ocean of varying sizes. So next we can ask the question, well, on all these different islands, how many species of plants and animals do you find on them? And what are the reasons that underlie how many species of plants and animals you find on these islands? This is a series of questions that fall under the heading of what's called island biogeographic theory. And it's been a topic of great interest among ecologists for the last 50 years now. So, what we might expect is that tiny island in the midground there, right in the center of our field of view, that little island we might expect has fewer species of trees, fewer species of animals than the island behind it, which is bigger. And we might expect also that the island in the foreground, this very large island, we might expect to find, and in fact we do, that this island has more species. And so those patterns suggest that some kind of underlying process must be occurring here. So let's consider what that might be. So let's turn our attention to a different view of these Palau Islands. These little island hummocks that you see out here are islands that are of limestone origin, and they are referred to as the Rock Islands. You can see how they kind of indent right at their base. That largest one in the field of view kind of indents at the base. Well, limestone is somewhat soluble in water, and so the base of these islands tends to be dissolved and also eroded away, so they have kind of a mushroom shape. And they're a little bit hard to get on, in fact, in many cases because of that. You have to hang onto trees and pull yourself onto them in order to get to them. Now, also notice this tiny, tiny little rock right in the foreground surrounded by water. That appears to have one single coconut tree on it, little seedling coconut, and that's about it. Now that little rock there was probably not much more than 2 yards across, to give you an idea of scale. So what we see is that as you get tinier, there are obviously fewer species. But again, the question is, what is the process that goes on here? And so a number of processes have been postulated. One has to do with, again, area itself. If you have a bigger area, then we can presume that the probability of colonization goes up, much like we saw with those marshes that we looked at earlier. And so over time you would expect that based on probability alone, more species are going to show up on larger islands. Another issue is that as islands get larger, it's likely that they will have more kinds of habitats and microhabitats and so on. Hence, more kinds of ecological niches available, and consequently more species. Another factor, in addition to area itself, is how close is the island to its mainland source, where all of the species that ultimately will colonize this island come from. So the thinking is that the closer an island is to its mainland source of species, the more species you will find there also. Even if it's small, if it's close to a mainland area, then you might expect to find more species on it, simply because the probability of colonization goes up. But then there are still other factors, factors that we could put under the heading of historical factors. So we're looking down here on the island of Agiguan, which is one of the Mariana Islands. It is a comparatively small one of these islands, and so we might expect that it has fewer species than its neighboring larger islands, although as it turns out, at least for birds, that's really not true. In fact, it has a species that does not occur on the neighboring island of Tinian. It has this species here, the golden white-eye. Golden white-eye has kind of an odd distribution in the Mariana Islands. It's found on the island of Agiguan, and then it's found again on the other side of Tinian on the island of Saipan. So it leapfrogs in distribution over the island of Tinian. So why isn't it on Tinian? Well, that we can conclude based on archaeological, paleontological kinds of studies. That is an accident, I suppose you could call it, of history. Once upon a time, the golden white-eye was on Tinian, but prehistoric humans, in modifying their habitat and in hunting for species of wild animals, and also in introducing things like rats and pigs to these islands, resulted in a number of the species on them becoming extinct. And in the case of the island of Tinian, the golden white-eye was one of the species that became extinct. So, not because of the probability of its colonization and all that sort of thing, but because of historical factors that weren't related to those other factors. So we can summarize classical thinking about island biogeographic theory like this. First of all, by the term biogeography, I mean the study of historical reasons for the distribution of species around the planet. In history, we can talk about history even in terms of tens of millions and hundreds of millions of years. And in the case of things like why there are no camels in North America, we're now into issues that deal with historical events of many tens of millions of years. Camels actually evolved in North America, even though they are no longer present. But let's talk specifically about island biogeographic theory. The three principal mechanisms that have been thought to be at work controlling the number of species found on islands include the area of the island, the distance of the island from a mainland source of species, and the diversity of habitats that are present. And to that, we can add this fourth factor of historical phenomena, including recent historical phenomena. Although we could also think in terms of longer-term history and whether or not an island has been present long enough for evolution of new species to have occurred. These larger scale kinds of issues in ecology are often discussed under the heading of landscape ecology, which is that field in which large patterns in nature are examined, things that occur in more than a single woodlot or a single wetland. But when we look at a larger region, then we see other kinds of patterns that we might not see if we're looking at a local area. Now, landscapes, large-scale areas, tend to have more than one kind of habitat present. So instead of just being a forested area, we might have, like you see in this image here, water, marshland, and then adjacent forest also. So as we change our focus from a specific site to the region as a whole, we start to see more habitats. And one of the important things that we see at this larger scale is this interaction among particular habitats, or we might refer to them more precisely as different kinds of plant communities. So the occurrence of a forest next to a marsh can provide cover and nesting sites for various kinds of species that feed in the marsh. So we saw that little blue heron actually will build its nest in the trees adjacent to the marsh, but then go into the marsh and in the associated tidal creeks to feed. And so the presence of multiple habitats is influencing what's going on at the larger scale, whether certain species can or cannot be present. Another example is the relationship of tidal marshes to the surrounding estuary, where that estuarine flushing, that fresh water coming in during part of the day and then salt water coming in part of the day, those kinds of things influence the productivity of the marsh. That's also part of this system. One of the important lessons that we can come away with a discussion of landscape ecology with is the idea that the scale at which we look at ecological phenomena matters. So, for example, with respect to species diversity patterns, if we look at the global scale, very frequently what people find is that energy is the principal controlling factor of the number of species that one finds across the globe. On the other hand, if we look at the landscape scale, such as this image, which is of Midwestern farm fields, laid out as they often are in a very precise grid pattern. At this scale, we might instead find that habitat, the characteristics of habitat, are most important in determining diversity patterns. The findings may differ from study to study and with the kinds of organisms that are being studied, but this is one that has turned up again and again at landscape scale kinds of studies. Now, at the local scale, we might find more varied kinds of explanations for patterns of diversity. Explanations that might have to do with competition between species, might have to do with the details of the structure of habitats, what kind of plant species are present, and so on. Now, I've been hinting that it's hard to talk about ecology without also talking about evolution. And this is exactly true. We think back to our Virginia rail. The reason why it may not recognize very tiny sites as habitat, I said, was a behavioral issue. And then we can ask, well, where did that behavior come from? And we can talk about how it evolved. So let's turn our focus now to the topic of evolution and how it relates to ecology. Let's review for a few minutes some terms that we need to have under our belt. The term natural selection, for example. That phenomenon where nature selects individuals with certain genetic traits as being superior and more likely to survive from one generation to the next. And so genes associated with that greater survivability get differentially passed on to the next generation. Now, the raw materials of evolution we can think of as being phenomenon of mutation, which is a genetic event, which can be brought about by a number of different kinds of routes, although probably the most important route in Earth history has been ultraviolet radiation, damaging the DNA molecule, somehow changing it. And of course, the source of that ultraviolet radiation is the sun. So whereas the sun is the giver of life on Earth, and also in organisms is a mutagenic agent. It changes what they are over time. Now, many of the kinds of genetic changes that can result from things like ultraviolet radiation, but other sources as well, many of those are going to be damaging to the organism and kill it, either outright or make it less successful in some way. Think of birth defects, for example, in humans, many of which have their origin in some kind of genetic malfunction. Well, not all of those changes in DNA are going to be negative. Some of them may confer some advantage on individuals. And so, consequently, what we can expect is that over time, individuals with those traits are going to be differentially passing on their genes. And so the gene's frequency in a population will increase. Now, of course, again, in nature, things are always more complicated than these kinds of explanations. We can also see change in genetic frequency that doesn't necessarily affect one's fitness, as we might call it. How fit you are to live and survive in an environment and effectively pass on your own genes by successfully reproducing. There are situations where gene frequencies can change for other kinds of reasons, some random chance kinds of factors, and these phenomena are known as genetic drift. We see it especially in island populations, and if you look at these photographs on the right, you see a very nice example of that. This is one species, the collared kingfisher, which occurs on a number of islands in the tropics. It is a widespread species in Southeast Asia and also in islands in tropical parts of the Pacific Ocean. And so we can find populations on some islands that have blue feathers on its head, and populations on a nearby island, just a matter of miles away, that has no blue feathers on the head. They have a white cap instead of a blue cap. And traits like that probably don't confer a whole lot in the way of selective, natural selection kind of advantage. They probably occurred because only a few founder individuals managed to get to an island across open ocean, and so they had only the genes that they arrived with, and so it's unlikely that a few individuals are going to contain the entire genetic complement of a population. So whatever they survived with when they got to that island, that's what got passed on to following generations. And so if we have a tiny founder population on one island and a tiny founder population on another island, it's very possible that over time, just because of random chance effects, they're going to diverge. This is a phenomenon referred to as the founder effect in evolution. Now, of course, the fact that you have an ocean surrounding an island, that tends to isolate whatever population happens to get started on it from these few founder individuals. And so these populations do tend to be quite genetically isolated from other populations. Even though birds can fly, they don't like to fly over open ocean all that much. At least land birds don't. Seabirds, of course, is a different story, but once a land bird population gets established on an isolated island, it's not likely to be exchanging genetic material with individuals on other islands or the mainland where its parent populations may have originally come from. And so that genetic isolation tends to reinforce these differences that can develop among populations. Now, I still have quite a bit to say about this theme of evolutionary ecology, but we have reached the end of our discussion for today, and so we will pick up the same theme again next time.